亲爱的朋友，大家好，今天是11月16号。今天先告诉一下，看看屏幕上这个 GOP wins，GOP 是美国共和党。美国共和党控制了美国的众议院，也就是说，这个佩洛西老太太当议长的那个众议院，民主党失守了，共和党控制，那个佩洛西老太太就得回家抱孙子去了啊，得退休了，没他的位置了啊，所以这个是人民的议会，下议院，在英国叫下院，在美国叫众议院，相当于咱们中国的全国人民代表大会啊。上议院呢，在美国叫参议院啊，参议院民主党赢啊，民主党险胜，赢了一票啊，这势均力敌啊，但是民主党赢了一票。在英国叫上议院，在美国叫参议院，在中国叫全国政协。全国政协相当于参议院，全国人民代表大会啊，叫相当于美国的众议院。这众议院的话，权力大得很啊。众议院这次上台之后，应该说，看《纽约时报》的报道哈，他是说他们最害怕的是共和党对总统发起弹劾，包括亨特、拜登啊这些事儿都会出来啊，都会揪这些事儿，可能要把拜登给弹劾下去。拜登也第一时间做了反应啊，拜登还没回家呢，还在印度尼西亚那个岛上在那开会呢。他说啊，还有人说弹劾我什么呀？他说的很这样 ，GOP 赢了啊，这是一个新闻啊，这个咱们今天就不主要讲。今天大家议论的比较多的呢是这个什么啊？加拿大的总理小土豆啊，Justin Trudeau 被习近平给训斥。习近平训斥小土豆啊！昨天啊，咱们这个节目讲了这个，我给大家详细的讲了，高屋建瓴的、最深入的讲了拜登啊跟习近平谈完话之后，谈了3个半小时，自己出来兴奋啊，自己80岁老头啊，习近平都累坏了，他这80岁老头兴致勃勃的自己召开记者招待会啊。这讲了一通，讲了20-30分钟啊，然后还回答了4个记者的问题啊，其中一个问题特别震动人心，就是这个俄罗斯从赫尔松撤军这个事儿，我也很关注，但是我不敢讲，为什么呢？因为有一种说法说这可能是俄罗斯造谣，俄罗斯摆的一个局啊，就是让你们不懂军事的人瞎讲，然后讲完一错，然后又是现在不是啊，是真的真的是俄罗斯败啊，守不住赫尔松，撤出来，乌克兰取得了巨大胜利，收复失地。但是昨天有一个突发新闻，说有一颗导弹落在了波兰啊，这个波兰和这个乌克兰交界的地方，在波兰一方炸死了2个人啊。说这个事儿，因为波兰可是不得了，波兰是北约的一部分，你敢侵略破坏波兰的领土完整的话，那它背后有靠山呐啊，这北约要这个什么？后来今天看了一下，说这个俄罗斯矢口否认，扯淡，你们这别滚一边去，和我没关系。自己查，北约自己的发言人出来说，看起来好像不是俄罗斯放的啊，也不是乌克兰放的，谁放的没说，好像是说这个导弹啊拦截系统这个盾牌系统的一部分，它是假设俄罗斯往北约的土地上，比如说往波兰扔这个核武器的时候，那么北约呢，在空中有一道拦截系统啊，这可能都是导弹，把这个导弹落地之前给它打掉，最好是能够让它落到俄罗斯的领土上去，那是最好，核污染去污染俄罗斯去，大概是这个系统当中的一部分落。这个还没有最后确定啊，我看美国也五角大楼也对这个事发表意见，各个大嘴名嘴都在讲这个事，我就不讲了。今天我重点给你们讲一讲小土豆为什么这么倒霉，触了习近平的眉头。这习近平昨天被拜登给训斥了一顿，习近平忍了。今天呢，各个国家都求见他啊，其中这小土豆跟他追着他跟他谈，哎，习叔叔这个那个的，习近平把眼睛一瞪，谁是你叔叔啊？我昨天跟你讲的话，你怎么一转身告诉记者了？你会做人会做事吗？ 很不高兴训斥的一对啊。这个事儿引起各个国家的人的评论，各种评论都有啊，尤其是各个聊天空间里，还有加拿大人都在说这个事儿啊。但是绝大多数人没讲到点儿上，绝大多数人讲不到点儿上。我今天李永康要把这个背景知识给你补上，要补上之后，你今天晚上我估计得睡不着觉。如果睡不着觉的话呢，您就别看了啊，别看了啊！这个节目比较刺激，今天我豁出去了啊！今天啊，先看之前先让你看一点这个，咱先补点这个，聊一聊，看看这是怎么回事啊？就是这张啊，这个好像是个截图，这是一个截图，咱找这个视频来看看啊。这个视频现在都在议论这个事儿，看了吧？啊，练这个 Tucker 都在议论啊，都在谈这个事儿。习近平 BBC 这有一个，这个是
不合适。Everything we discuss is leaked to the paper. That's not appropriate. 而且我们也不是那样进行的。And that's not how the way the conversation was conducted. 如果有诚心，咱们就以互相尊重的态度来进行很好的沟通。否则这个结果就不好说了。If there is sincerity on your part, free and open and frank dialogue, and that is what we will continue to have. We will.
老习气坏了，老习根本没给他好脸色。
But there will be things we will disagree on, and we will have. 一些可以建设性，创造条件，创造条件。Let's create the conditions first. 好。
这是《纽约时报》的。
否则这个结果就不好说了。If there is sincerity on your part, free and open and frank dialogue, and that is what we will continue to have. We will continue to look.
小土豆缠着他，有求于习近平。注意看啊，
创造条件。
习近平带理不搭的啊，习近平带理不搭的。《华尔街日报》也评论这个事儿，都在议论这个事儿，这好像是一个大新闻。太多了，我刚才看的那个最好的那个，一时半会儿找不着了。有一个最好的，那个好，哎，这个好。
不合适。Everything we discuss is leaked to the paper. That's not appropriate. 而且我们也不是那样进行的。And that's not how the way the conversation was conducted. 如果有诚心，咱们就以互相尊重的态度来进行很好的沟通。If there is 否则这个结果就不好说了。If there is sincerity on your part, free and open and frank dialogue, and that is what we will continue to have. We will continue to look to work constructively together. But there
习近平连眼睛都不看，连还都不看他。
创造条件，创造条件。Let's create the conditions first. 好。
出来一个美女，注意看啊，有一个美女，对，这不知道是哪国的一个女间谍。对，这个事儿是这样的哈，这个事儿你能看出来，习近平对这个小土豆呢，带理不搭，而且是态度训斥啊，这个有几个方面因素。第一个习近平今年70岁了，69岁70岁，小土豆才刚50岁，他1971年出生，所以说相当于子侄辈儿吧，就是比他大1倍，所以当个大侄子训斥他，这是第一啊，这个非常重要啊。第二，习近平对他是不满意的，为什么？一个换俩呀，两个换一个呀。孟晚舟这个事儿处理的时候，小土豆的表现有点太夸张了呀，习主席很不高兴啊。习主席用2个买口才换回了孟晚舟，你感觉习主席这个人质外交 有点亏了啊，亏了嘛啊！所以这个习主席觉得你小土豆你怎么回事呢？你懂事儿不懂啊？啊，我们祖上可没有亏待你祖上啊！注意啊，这要害是在第三件事呢，这个习近平没讲出口，这就是我今天要给大家补上。你看看啊，你看看，哎，这个很有趣啊！这些媒体、报纸、名嘴、大嘴，没有一个讲到习近平为什么这么不高兴啊！一个是昨天受了这个拜登的训斥，一个是对于这个处理孟晚舟这个人质事件、人质交换事件不满意，你没给我面子还是不够啊！第三个呢，他比他大1倍啊！再加上最主要的，习近平认为你们土豆家族的短儿在我们共产党手捏着呢，我们共产党没少给你钱，没少给你宣传，你怎么这么不懂事儿啊？那因为是个什么事？其实很小的一个事，大概是小土豆接受加拿大还是外国的记者的访问，讲了一点跟习近平谈话的一些内容，习近平就等于是不高兴了，很不高兴。老习感觉到受辱了，这会儿佩洛西退休了啊。
Dynasty in modern times are the Trudeaus. Pierre Trudeau was a flamboyant and passionate labor lawyer who went on to serve as Prime Minister of Canada for more than a decade. He was philosophically attracted to communist China and would later cash in on the relationship he enjoyed with the Beijing ruling elite. The torch in the family would be passed to his sons, one of whom, Justin, would enter Parliament in 2008 and later ascend to the Prime Minister's office. As we will see, the family's warm ties to China and China-linked entities play an essential role in their personal fortunes and influence how they govern. Before the story is told, it is important to note that it is impossible to know the full extent of the Trudeau family's commercial and other ties with Beijing because in 2019 it was revealed that Canada's top spy agency had destroyed its files on Pierre Trudeau 30 years earlier. Trudeau died in 2000, and the documents had been expected to be released in 2020. The move was audacious and denounced by historians as both outrageous and a crime against Canadian history. Pierre Trudeau was a French-Canadian with a lifelong fixation on China. The interest was initially about ideology. Trudeau was influenced in his early years by socialism. The Party of the People Socialism, communism will eventually come out the winner, he wrote as a young man. He first visited China in 1949. As the country was engulfed in the revolutionary violence between the communist forces led by Mao and the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek. He traveled again in 1960 with his friend Jacques Ha Copyright Bert, this time at the request of the communist government. The invitation was unusual. Few Westerners.
这个地方是揭露小土豆家族跟中国共产党的这个长久的这个来往。这个说起来，这个说来话长了，今天晚上1-2个小时讲不完。我在一些这个空间里啊，Clubhouse 里啊，有一些这讲啊，他们觉得受不了，从来没听说过，哪有这么离谱的事儿啊？事儿，确实有这个事儿啊。你们加拿大人要去做研究，去查这个小土豆他爹老土豆皮埃尔土豆啊。历史有些东西最关键的找不着了啊，就是那个老情报烧掉了啊，有一场大火烧掉了，找不着。我可以挑一张照片让你们见识这个土豆家族牛逼到什么地步啊？你看看这个我想很容易找到周恩来的照片吧，应该。你们搜周恩来，搜这个土豆，你们先听一会儿啊，听一会儿。
Were invited to visit the country, and Trudeau was hardly a prominent figure at the time. He had yet to enter Parliament. Trudeau and Ha Copyright Bert traveled the country with official guides during the height of the Great Leap Forward, when millions of Chinese were confined, arrested, or killed by the regime. Trudeau later wrote about the trip in a book he co-authored called Two Innocents in Red China. He was enormously sympathetic to the regime and failed to take note of anything involving repression, violence, and death around him. Goals have no more reality than the means that are devised to reach them. Indeed, the experience of that superb strategist, Mao Zedong, might lead us to conclude that in a vast and heterogeneous country, the possibility of establishing socialist strongholds in certain regions is the very best thing, the two wrote. This travelogue of his visit to China is filled with na-veta copyright and revolutionary sloganeering. Trudeau and Ha copyright Bert posed for pictures with the members of Young Pioneers, the Communist Party youth group rich in indoctrination, and proclaimed, "It is these red-scarfed kids who in 20 years will be the new men of a country which at that time will have 1 billion inhabitants." While making no mention of the Red Terror that was taking place, they claimed, the Chinese revolutionaries influence adults, they even give some attention to the old, but it is on the young that they found all their hopes. The trip afforded Trudeau the rare opportunity to meet with both Chairman Mao and Zhou Enlai, his right hand. Why the two young French Canadians were granted such a meeting is unclear. Trudeau was awed by the two brutal leaders. He would regard Mao as the great helmsman, steering the Chinese state as a benevolent leader. Zhou Enlai, who helped Mao carry out the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, resulting in the estimated deaths of 50 million or more people, he described in warm, congenial terms. Our firm impression was of a simple person, deeply committed to the communist cause, but not at all with the aim of achieving personal power, one who was almost deferential to all those around him, whether Chinese villagers or foreign guests, a decent human being who attracted respect because of his person, not his position. Trudeau's book was openly supportive of the communist regime. One friendly reviewer stated, observing and conversing with local farmers, Trudeau discovers Chairman Mao Zedong's logic in fomenting his communist revolution amongst peasants rather than industrial workers, and gains an understanding into why the 1960s Cultural Revolution was deemed necessary for communism to triumph. Trudeau would retain his sympathies for the communist regime, even as the horrors of the Maoist era became well known in the West. Throughout his career, Trudeau was much harsher on the nationalist government in Taiwan than on the communist dictatorship on the mainland. Later, in retirement, he described the nationalists as dictatorial and brutal, but argued that when it came to mainland China, to fail to recognize the undoubted successes of the communist regime would be foolhardy. Beijing authorities were no doubt thrilled with Trudeau's account of Maoist China. On the eve of his son Justin's rise into national politics, a Chinese government-controlled publishing house released a Chinese-language version of the book. What the Chinese government paid the Trudeaus for the rights to the book is unknown. The book was launched at a lavish press conference in Shanghai with co-author Jacques Ha copyright Bert and Alexander Trudeau, Justin's younger brother, fielding questions from 50 Chinese journalists. Ha copyright Bert called the republication of the 45-year-old book a miracle. Alexander reflects, indeed, one must truly ask why it is that, almost half a century after its publication in Canada, a big
这个地方讲的呢是老土豆，就是小土豆他爹40-50年前写过一本跪舔毛泽东文化大革命的一本书。这个跪舔的程度，这不是白左的舔了啊，这个是这个透心红啊，这个是比今天的五毛，比今天的小粉红跪舔的姿势还他妈丑恶啊！40-50年前吧，文化大革命最荒谬的时候，他写的一本书啊，现在中国啊高调组织团队把它翻译出版，上海译林出版社有出版。那这个呢，表面上看是一个文化交流，出一本书，实际上呢，专家认为这个是洗钱、资金转移，支持他，让他儿子出来参政，啊，这就是。
Chinese publishing house would decide to launch a Chinese edition of this relatively obscure little book. Why, indeed? Perhaps because it was an opportunity to put some money in the pocket of a powerful political family in Canada and cultivate the relationship further. Pierre Trudeau was elected to Parliament in 1965 and, within a couple of years, decided to seek the leadership of the Liberal Party. He became Prime Minister in 1968. One of his first acts was to seek and achieve
老土豆
diplomatic
1968
relations with
年当了
Beijing, which occurred in
总理
1970. For good measure, Trudeau dropped diplomatic ties with Taiwan, something that the United States did not do when Richard Nixon established relations with China in 1972. Mao saw the move by Trudeau as a significant victory, and reportedly said, "Now we have a friend in the U.S. backyard." Trudeau continued with his enthusiastic courtship of Beijing. In 1970,
老土豆是一个坚定的共产主义分子，对中国共产党、对于毛泽东、对周恩来比亲爹还亲，不是个白左问题啊，这是一个骨子里边认同共产主义。他写的书里边，中国人民所受毛泽东的苦难，一个字儿都不写，明白吗？这就是土豆家族。
73, the Prime Minister and his wife made a landmark trip to China and officials pulled out all the stops. His wife, Margaret, recalled about the arrival ceremony. There were maybe 10,000 children out on the tarmac with ribbons. Some of them were as small as 3 and 4, dancing in perfect symmetry, singing, "Long live the friendship between the peoples of China and Canada." Margaret Trudeau explained, "The children were very, very disciplined and very courteous." During the visit, her husband, the Prime Minister, held extensive talks with Chinese officials, with his most valued memory of the visit discussing politics with Zhou Enlai, far into the night. When the Trudeaus returned home, the Prime Minister spoke in Parliament in glowing terms about China. He extolled members on the importance of recognizing the magnitude of one of the most significant revolutions in the history of the world and the extension of basic human amenities to hundreds of millions of persons to whom they had been denied for millennia. Pierre Trudeau had close ties in Beijing, but critical to his rise in national politics was his alliance with a powerful corporation that wanted to do business with China. Aptly named, the Power Corporation was headed by a fellow Quebecer, Paul Desmarais, a highly connected businessman who cozied up to political figures and enriched them. His company had supported Trudeau for a long time, beginning in the 1960s when Trudeau sought the leadership of the Liberal Party. Paul Desmarais collects prime ministers and senior politicians like rare butterflies, said journalist Peter Newman. He adds, one of his favorite collectibles was Pierre Trudeau. Desmarais was a forceful advocate for business deals with Beijing. Like Trudeau, he ignored the repressive nature of the Chinese regime and embraced the brutal leaders as friends. Later, one of the prized paintings displayed on the wall in his palatial home was given to him by his good friend Li Peng, who gave the infamous orders to declare martial law in China leading to the massacre at Tiananmen Square. In 1978, the Power Corporation formed the Canada-China Business Council with Prime Minister Trudeau's support. The organization included Canadian business firms, but also the Chinese government-run China International Trust and Investment Corporation, CITIC. The purpose of the council was not just to help Canadian businesses get access to China, but also to help CITIC invest in Canada. Desmarais, and his role in starting the venture, helped the council set in motion the beginnings of investment in Canada by Chinese state-owned companies. Jonathan Manthorpe, a longtime journalist and author of a book about Chinese influence in Canada, calls the Canada-China Business Council the CCP's principal channel for influence in Canada. Trudeau and Desmarais guided Canada's relationship with Beijing, with Trudeau as Prime Minister pushing closer relations with the regime while Desmarais cashed in on significant deals with Beijing's elite. When Trudeau retired from politics, he went to work at Power Corporation, further nurturing those deals and becoming wealthy in the process. The legacy of these arrangements would provide a robust base of support when his son Justin would run for Prime Minister decades later. Trudeau continued to be a booster of China throughout his tenure. When he left office in 1984, he remained close to the Chinese regime. Trudeau's fidelity to China financially benefited the family as he exploited his cozy relationships in Beijing. The former Prime Minister became a consultant for Canadian businesses looking to access the Chinese market. Trudeau could use his ties with Chinese officials to help for a price. Beijing had long used commercial market access to reward friends, and Canadian companies looking for access to Chinese leaders paid Trudeau handsomely. Much of his work was for the Power Corporation. He signed on as an international advisor to the firm. During his tenure, Power Corp has been building its connections at the highest levels of the Chinese government. The result has been a series of investments across China in industries as diverse as real estate, railcars, and high technology. There were also joint ventures in Canada with CITIC investing capital along with the company. Trudeau also became a lawyer at a Montreal firm, where he was paid to help even more companies score meetings with Chinese leaders, including a business delegation to China in 1985. He returned the following year with another group of clients, and officials at the highest levels of the communist government greeted them, including Deng Xiaoping, in the Great Hall of the People. During the summer of 1989, Trudeau received an invitation from Beijing to visit with two of his sons, including future Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Unfortunately, horrific events intervened when the People's Liberation Army sent tanks into Tiananmen Square to attack student protesters. According to Alexander Trudeau, the family debated, should they still go? Eventually, the Canadian government asked them to stay home, settling the matter. But the following year, the opportunity arose again, and former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau brushed aside any qualms about going, aside from the optics. My father was still a little concerned about appearances, Alexander recalled. On the trip, according to Alexander, his father danced around the subject of Tiananmen Square with government officials. When called to speak, my father would invariably refer very delicately to the sad difficulties that China had recently faced. Sad difficulties almost implied that some external disaster rather than a brutal crackdown had occurred. But Pierre Trudeau would tell his government hosts, outsiders simply cannot know what is best for China nor how it need travel down its chosen paths. Trudeau added softly, it is hard to know how China needs to move forward. The events of Tiananmen Square appeared to be little more than a nuisance or a speed bump in Trudeau's race to work with Beijing. According to Alexander, this suspension of judgment toward China never left him, and there is plenty of evidence that those sympathies were passed along to his sons. In 2008, Justin Trudeau ran for parliament. His father had died 8 years earlier, but his name, good looks, and charming demeanor helped him rise quickly through the ranks of the Liberal Party. His views on China were similar to those of his father. Recall that during a 2013 Liberal Party fundraiser in Toronto, he had expressed his admiration for the basic dictatorship of China. It was not just Trudeau's words of admiration for the regime in Beijing. The young MP also endorsed policies that benefited the Chinese state. In 2012, he outlined his support for a controversial energy deal involving the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation, which was seeking to acquire the Canadian energy company Nexen. There were concerns about the significant implications to national security and possible damage to Canadian interests and values. Trudeau's attitude seemed to allow for considerably expanding China's investments in Canada, a view he said stemmed in part because obviously, my family has historical ties with China. When Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister in 2015, Beijing greeted the news with great enthusiasm. The Chinese ambassador to Canada declared his election meant real change, a move away from the previous government's skepticism about Beijing. He also noted the extraordinary political vision of Justin's father. Chinese officials appreciated that his father had not let matters like human rights or geopolitical issues cloud trade. Pierre Trudeau didn't allow much politics to color Canada-China relations, recalled the executive deputy director for the Center for Canadian Studies at the Guangzhou Institute of Foreign Languages, Tang Xiaosong. He took politics out of economic and trade relations. The younger Trudeau, I think, will very much follow in the footsteps of his father, because his father had a very positive stance toward China. Indeed, in 2016 the state-owned Yilin Press published a Chinese edition of Justin's memoirs retitled As the Legend Continues. Beijing's ambassador to Canada proclaimed that he strongly recommended the book. Curiously, some of Trudeau's national security aides were not even aware that the rights to his memoir had been sold to Beijing, not finding out until 2021, after being contacted by the media. I think what gets me is that this is all being sponsored by the propaganda department, said Richard McFadden, a former Trudeau advisor who also served as the head of the Canadian Intelligence Service. Trudeau's aides would later explain that all profits from the book were going to the Red Cross. But the Globe and Mail newspaper could not confirm that claim with either the publisher or the Red Cross. The Communist Party publication Global Times looked at the younger Trudeau's soft spot for Beijing and added, Junior Trudeau has obviously been influenced by his family's political opinions. In May 2016, Justin Trudeau was in a beautiful mansion in Toronto for a political fundraiser. At a cost of $1,500 a head, it was a small, elite affair with only 32 people in attendance, perhaps not so unusual for a politician. In this case, however, the host of the event and some of the guests coughing up donations would raise eyebrows. Benson Wang, the chairman of the Chinese Business Chamber of Commerce, had opened up his mansion for the gala and several other Chinese billionaires attended. One of them, Zhang Bin, was no ordinary businessman. He was a political advisor to the Beijing government and head of something called the China Cultural Industry Association, which the communist government supervised. One attendee at the fundraiser was controversial Chinese businessman Wei Wei. a real estate developer who actively worked to foster closer relations between China and Canada. Among multiple meetings, Wei had a private discussion with Prime Minister Trudeau, along with 3 other representatives of a Chinese government-endorsed industry group. In 2020, police raided Wei's ornate 20,000-square-foot home near Toronto for running an illegal gambling operation. There were allegations of trafficking women, too. The money moving through these underground casinos leads to huge profits for criminals that fund other ventures such as prostitution and drug trafficking, said the York Regional Police in a statement. Trudeau raised a good amount of money that day. Shortly after that fundraiser, the Trudeau Foundation announced that Zhang had made another contribution, this time a $200,000 donation, to honor the memory and leadership of Justin Trudeau's father. Also chipping in was Niu Gensheng, another wealthy Chinese businessman. The Trudeau Foundation, which was seeded with Canadian taxpayer money, had been established to memorialize the late Prime Minister and his political views. The family was naturally involved. Justin Trudeau had been a member of the board of directors and brother Alexander was still on the board, as was another member of the family. Additional funds were also donated for a statue of Pierre Trudeau. Alexander Trudeau, in accepting the gifts, promised they would strengthen the Sino-Canadian friendship developed by his father, according to the Chinese government's China Daily. In 2016, Justin Trudeau flew to China for a series of high-level meetings. Chinese social media took a liking to Trudeau, calling him Little Potato, shortly after he visited the country. Trudeau directly linked Canada's fate to China. During a visit to Shanghai on that trip, he told the Canada-China Business Council that the success of the world is inexorably linked to China's success. He never precisely defined what a successful China would look like, but he called for more trade and closer economic ties. When he finally raised the issue of human rights, he was quick to point out that Canada is bad, too. I talked about the challenges, but also talked about the fact that Canada is not immune to criticisms on human rights, either, he said during an on-stage interview at a Canadian Chamber of Commerce event in Hong Kong. The lack of any candor about the repressive nature of the communist regime runs deep in the Trudeaus. Brother Alexander Trudeau says that both he and his brother inherited much of their thinking about China from their father. When asked about the human rights situation in China, Alexander responded, "I could be very harsh, and you could find stories that are disgusting, but in a way I'm harsher on Canada, or way more on the United States, which I think have every reason to be better." The Trudeau family clearly has a soft spot for strongman tyrants. Alexander Trudeau described Fidel Castro, whose government killed, tortured, and imprisoned thousands of Cubans, this way in a eulogy. His intellect is one of the most broad and complete that can be found. He is an expert on genetics, on automobile combustion engines, on stock markets, on everything. Combined with a Herculean physique and extraordinary personal courage, this monumental intellect makes Fidel the giant that he is. Pierre Trudeau and his family have justified their silence on matters of human rights because they do not want to judge Chinese values by Western standards. This is a naive and absurd position. It also happens to be a favorite line of argument pushed by the CCP. The suppression of rights and the brutality of the regime in China is not a function of Chinese values. Marxism-Leninism is not a Chinese idea, it is a profoundly Western idea. Repression in the country is a function of a Leninist dictatorship run by the Chinese Communist Party. The brutality that occurs in China is similar to that of every Marxist-Leninist regime. The Soviet Union, East Germany, and Cuba, to name a few. But as we have seen, the ties are more than ideological. Alexander Trudeau is more than the brother of Prime Minister Trudeau. He has also served as his foreign policy advisor when Justin ran for the leadership of the Liberal Party. He wrote a book about China retracing his father's steps taken during that 1960 visit. The book was, in Alexander's words, commissioned by the Beijing government. How much he was paid has not been disclosed. When he released the book, Alexander explained, "I now look at our own freedoms with a little more circumspection and consider some of the irresponsible nature of some of the freedoms we enjoy." He also praised the communist dictatorship in Beijing, explaining that China could not have come so far so quickly without the unity and organizational power of the dictatorial government. His brother read the book as prime minister before making his first official trip to China. He read it a week before he left for China, and he told me it helped him get up to speed in what to think and feel about China, recalled Alexander. The Trudeau's apologetics for the Beijing regime have become increasingly unpopular in Canada. Mounting concerns among the Canadian public about Beijing's growing influence in their country prompted Trudeau's government to become involved in a 2-year effort to persuade Canadians that China is not so bad. The initiative, funded by major Canadian corporations, was titled Public Policy Forum, Consultative Forum in China. The goal was to push Canadian public opinion to favor more trade with China. It does not appear to have worked. Trudeau's government took other steps to accede to Beijing's wishes. In March 2017, the administration overturned a previous order pushed by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service to bar a Chinese company called ONET from taking over a Canadian research company called ITF Technologies. The Beijing government partly owned ONET, and ITF was developing technology related to fiber laser-directed energy weapons. Not too much later, Trudeau's administration permitted another Chinese firm, Hytera, to buy Norsat International, a Canadian firm that provides military satellite communication systems to the U.S. Department of Defense and the government of Taiwan. Reportedly, Trudeau's government agreed to allow the purchase without even doing an in-depth security review. As Prime Minister, Trudeau joined forces with Beijing and took a stake in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was being hailed as China's competition for the World Bank. This happened despite Canadian diplomats' warnings that the bank was going to be used to leverage its economic prowess to gain regional influence and export its model of governance around the world. They argued, China promotes perspectives on governance, economic security, and human rights that diverge in fundamental ways from Canada's. The Trudeau government ignored the warnings. When Prime Minister Trudeau was re-elected in October 2019, he made some changes. Among them was the appointment of a new foreign minister, Frana Section OIS Philippe Champagne. The new foreign minister was almost gushy in his praise of the Beijing regime. In a 2017 interview with Chinese state television, CGTN, he explained how wonderful President Xi and the government were because they stand out as a beacon of stability, predictability, a rule-based system, a very inclusive society. Champagne also happened to have borrowed more than $1 million from the Bank of China to buy 2 apartments in London. When the loan was exposed, he changed banks. Relations between China and Canada have deteriorated. After Canadian officials arrested a Huawei executive in 2018 for extradition to the United States on criminal charges, Beijing retaliated by detaining 2 Canadians on spy charges. The Canadian public became increasingly suspicious of the Chinese regime given its aggressive conduct. When the Canadian government joined the United States and the European Union in sanctioning Chinese officials involved in the suppression of the Uyghurs, some turned angrily on Trudeau. Boy, your greatest achievement is to have ruined the friendly relations between China and Canada, and have turned Canada into a running dog of the U.S., tweeted Li Yong, a Chinese diplomat posted to the embassy in Brazil. But Trudeau was hardly leading the parade. He gave all indications of being a reluctant participant. Just 2 months earlier, on February 22, 2021, the Canadian House of Commons voted 266-0 in support of a resolution calling China's actions against the Uyghurs genocide. Trudeau and his cabinet abstained from the vote. Critics note that during the height of the pandemic, the Trudeau administration granted lucrative contracts to a Chinese company to produce personal protective equipment to fight the COVID virus over Canadian firms that had the same capacity. And when the prominent Canadian Halifax International Security Forum invited Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen to receive the John McCain Prize for Leadership in Public Service, the Trudeau government tried to pressure it to disinvite her. When Prime Minister Trudeau leaves office, he will no doubt be looking for financial opportunities just as his father and so many other politicians have. Will he mimic his father and brother, building on his own network of government contacts in China? His family's history seems to indicate that he will. And, of course, he will conduct the balance of his tenure in office precisely with that in mind. Chapter 8, Higher Education. Nathan Law has lived a remarkable and impactful life even though he has not yet reached the age of 30. It was for good reason that Time magazine named him one.
把这个小土豆的家族给挖了一下，大家是不是清楚多了？这样你再去理解小土豆跟习近平的这个交流的这个整个过程，这个肢体语言，你就一下就豁然开朗了。小土豆是党的人，这个家族都是党的人。行，请大家提点尖锐一点的问题，我回答2个。我给习近平出的方案就说，赶快称帝，然后呢，宣布解散共产党，然后与民约法，和人民签署一部宪法，照宪法办事儿。习近平享受巨大的荣誉，这个荣誉可以世袭罔替，可以传给自己的子女，可以传给任何人，他愿意传给谁就传给谁，这是他的特权。同时，他把实权交还给中国人民。实权交还给中国人民是个什么概念啊？就是美国这样啊，选举全国人民代表大会，选举全国政协啊，这都是议会的上院和下院。然后选举国务院，总理是谁啊？学加拿大学日本，学英国都可以，君主立宪。这样的话呢，习近平把实权交出来，他自己可以随时退休，他退休也好，不退休也好，他不需要上班了，他享受的是一个巨大的荣誉，这个荣誉也很重要。你看人家那个英国女王伊丽莎白2世，那荣誉也是很大的，受到全世界人民、全人类的敬仰祭拜、怀念褒奖。尤其你找个香港人问问香港人虽然是曾经是英国女皇下边的殖民地你看香港人是怎么评价英国女皇的，也很厉害，挺好。习近平玩好了，可以把这个实权交出去，享受虚君的称号，就可以避免走毛泽东死在任上这个悲剧了。元首说，为什么普京没去 G20？ 他主要到那儿也没朋友了。这个 G20 相当于最高领导人之间的一个 party， 你去了之后连个能说话的人都没有，你跟谁说话呀？没人搭理他。只有习近平可能还愿意跟他搭话，问题是习近平的话他也不信了。习近平现在跟普京的真实的关系还真是一个谜，说不太清楚。X 说，这就是中国人面临的国际环境。这个是习近平带领的中国政府和中国共产党所面临的国际环境四周看一看，全是敌人，没有真朋友，这怎么整啊？行，今天呢总结一下我们没有尖锐问题了。我看，首先今天呢这个美国中期选举，下议院议会下议院，也就是众议院，结果出来了，共和党胜利，也就是佩洛西没有他的位置了，退休了，老太太退休吧。习近平总算出了一口气这口气出来了。你看这8月份这老太太那么着急的去台湾干嘛呀？台湾也没有说非得说请你非来不可，他就是要配合蔡英文就是羞辱一下习近平。 习近平画红线了，红线不许触摸红线，不许突破红线，我们要打，我们要采取结果怎么着啊？结果这个红线，这个笑死人了啊！这次习近平可以高兴了，今天晚上习近平好好睡个觉啊，喝点酒，喝点小酒啊，让彭丽媛给你好好做个按摩，洗洗脚，好好玩一玩啊，睡个觉吧。终于佩洛西老太太退休了，可以退休了啊，没她的位置了啊，换上一个共和党的人上来主导美国的众议院，那会不会对习近平网开一面呢？你说呢？对付中国强硬，这个是两党的共识，谁上来都得这么干，只能比赛着往上搞啊。但是美国政治由于共和党控制了众议院，那么民主党控制着参议院，所以会有很多新的玩法啊。刚才咱们念的那一段小土豆的家族故事，可以说小土豆家族土豆家族和中国共产党的秘密历史，这一段这是一本书里写的。这个书呢刚刚出版，这个书的标题就叫做Red-handed， 还真没法翻这个 Red 就是共产党的红色嘛，红色江山这个意思Handed 呢是偷人东西被人家抓住了，抓了脏了那些美国呀、加拿大呀、欧洲这些这些家伙们跟中国共产党联手做生意接受共产党的贿赂，给共产党洗钱，共产党通过美国华人给美国的这个选举这个政治现金这些乱七八糟的事全他妈的有包括横穿拜登全有都研究得很清楚，就得等着找个机会追究这个事儿。这是第一第二，昨天有一个重要情节没来及讲。昨天实际上拜登在召开记者会的时候，习近平没有出现原因，第一他很累，谈判3个半小时谁受得了70岁以上老头谁受不了，这是第一。第二，习近平觉得被这个拜登给羞辱了，拜登昨天是人逢喜事精神爽，他的参议院他的党胜了，这是第一。第二，乌克兰战场上这个俄罗斯撤军了，我操，这个事儿好他这个说老头这么爽专门找习近平不爱听的话训斥他训斥完事之后呢，记者会上有一个东西没讲到的，在他的白宫网站新闻稿里边是有的，讲到一个什么东西就是讲到一些美籍华人，就是一些美国人吧，在中国被习近平下令给抓了，拜登要求他谈判的时候要求你把这些人给我放了。抓的这些什么人呢？没有明确说什么原因抓的呢？肯定是就跟抓那个2个加拿大的迈克尔一样嘛我判断中国是以美国间谍的名义抓的，管你是不是间谍，扣一个间谍的帽子给你抓起来，准备干嘛呀？他防止美国抓中国的间谍，这就是玩间谍交易了，搞人质交易了。那这个夹在中间的美籍华人可能要倒霉了。所以我提醒美籍华人，如果你非去中国不可，在中国有生意有应酬，可是一定要小心别做了牺牲品，一定要注意自己的安全。习近平由于在这个孟晚舟人质交换事件当中得了手，他觉得他占了上风了，占了便宜了。人质外交按照美国的老传统是坚决打掉，不能惯着你这玩人质外交所以美国这个是历史悠久，经验丰富，但是不知道为什么他让习近平赢了。习近平感觉到这个换回孟晚舟这个事儿，我们批了100个条子，最后赢了，美国扛不住，玩不起，赢了。这个是美国一个重大失误，这就意味着习近平还会继续玩人质外交。当时有一个特殊情况，当时是一个这个引渡孟晚舟回美国这个事儿呢，是川普任内发起的 旷日持久，拖的时间太长，事儿没完成呢，川普下位了啊，拜登上台之后，拜登稀里糊涂的刚熟悉工作的时候，就把孟晚舟以人质交换的形式让习近平给要回去了。这事儿实际上回头一看啊，不妥。美国呢也想打掉牙咽下去，就忍了啊，就不追究这个事儿了。可是等了1年半，美国的第一大报《华尔街日报》还是发出了长篇的报道发了一篇长文报道这个事儿，就把这个事情向读者、向人民交代清楚了，就是我们吃了亏了。当时这个文章就是《华尔街日报》剖析中美关系恶化，为什么恶化呀？这个实际上是以孟晚舟人质交换事件为重要转折点，标志性事件就是这个事儿。美国历史上没有吃过这么大的亏呀！美国跟伊朗搞了多少次，跟阿拉伯世界搞了多少次人质外交，哪次美国让步过？那这次由于小土豆加拿大这个总理天天追着美国领导人哭诉，你把2个马克给我要回来，所以搞得美国有点烦了。美国是出于给加拿大一个面子做了让步，把孟晚舟给放回去了。这一下习近平高兴的跳脚东升西降，东升西降，他真的觉得东升西降这不妥啊。但是我觉得美籍华人亚裔华人就是美籍亚裔到中国去旅行的时候一定要注意保护自己，小心防止成为人质外交的一个牺牲品。就这句话。行，我这个基本上想说的话今天讲完了，主要是给你们补上土豆家族的这个和中国共产党的这个秘密历史，这个给你们讲清楚。另外加拿大他们情报部门的这个图书馆里的档案，关于土豆家族的老档案，30年前一把火烧掉了，找不着了，查无实证。好，谢谢大家，再见。